Welcome back to my channel Famous and Fabulous. In March 2020, the episode titled Burlesque Queen of American Pickers aired, marking what would become a heart-wrenching and bittersweet moment for fans of the show. At the time, viewers had no idea that this episode would be the final appearance of Frank Fritz, the beloved co-star who had spent 2 decades uncovering hidden treasures alongside Mike Wolfe. But looking back now, it's clear that what seemed like just another day of picking was anything but ordinary. The episode itself gives a glimpse into the final chapter of Frank's journey on the show, but a deeper look reveals an emotional and poignant story that was unfolding beneath the surface. The episode follows Frank and Mike as they visit a dusty, abandoned marina in Kansas City, Missouri, eager to unearth treasures hidden in the overgrown landscape. To anyone watching casually, it might have appeared to be just another routine pick. But there was a palpable tension in the air. From the decaying boats and rusted signs half buried in dirt to the sense of desolation surrounding the marina, something felt off. Even the banter between Mike and Frank seemed different, a bit forced, as though they were trying to mask the unease that lingered beneath their words. Frank, ever the consummate professional, was still focused on the task at hand, meticulously combing through the piles of forgotten relics. Yet, for those who paid close attention, there were subtle signs that something was not quite right. Frank, usually known for his infectious energy, was visibly struggling. As he sifted through piles of clutter, there was a moment when Frank shifted, slightly, rubbing his back in a way that suggested discomfort. For most viewers, this would have been easily overlooked, but looking back, it's clear that Frank's chronic pain was already taking a toll on him. While he continued to push through, as he always did, there was an undeniable weight behind his actions. Frank had spent years grappling with Crohn's disease, but by this point, his ongoing back issues, which he rarely spoke about, had become an increasing burden. Despite the pain, Frank soldiered on. He engaged in his usual sharp negotiations, haggling over an old Phillips 66 sign and a small Kawasaki motorcycle, never letting the seller's stubbornness push him past his price limits. The deal was sealed for $2,000, and in typical Frank fashion, he was proud of his negotiating prowess. But as the camera lingered on his face, there was something different. His smile didn't reach his eyes quite the way it used to, and his movements appeared slower, more deliberate. There was a tiredness about him, a fatigue that wasn't immediately obvious but became clearer in hindsight. The pit continued, and Frank found a vintage Mercury outboard motor logo sign, along with an old grandfather clock buried deep in the clutter. Again, he negotiated expertly, bringing the price down to $750, another win for the master picker. But this time, Frank's laughter was shorter, more strained, and his breathing seemed heavier. He was still sharp and witty, but it was apparent that his body was beginning to betray him, a stark contrast to the energetic and carefree persona that had endeared him to fans for so long. In the aftermath of the episode, fans took to online, forums and social media to express their emotions. Many rewatched the episode and were struck by how different Frank seemed. Some fans even described how they cried after realizing that this would be the last time they would see Frank on American Pickers, a show that had become an integral part of their lives. The emotional weight of the final scenes was especially poignant given Frank's tragic death a few years later. In hindsight, the fans' comments and reflections on Frank's last appearance were deeply touching, with many expressing how much they missed his warmth, humor, and genuine heart. One fan shared that they had bought a black cat hat, a trademark of Frank's, as a tribute to the man who had inspired them in ways they hadn't even fully realized at the time. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Frank's final episode wasn't what the viewers saw on screen, but what they didn't. Behind the scenes, things were much more complicated. No official announcement had been made about Frank's departure from the show, leaving fans in the dark. As the season progressed, Mike continued alone in episodes, leaving many fans confused, frustrated, and eventually deeply concerned. Rumors began to swirl about everything from health problems to potential feuds and even accusations of betrayal. The uncertainty surrounding Frank's absence only intensified the mystery, with fans speculating endlessly about what had really happened. In hindsight, these rumors were rooted in the reality of Frank's struggles, though at the time, no one truly understood the full extent of what he was going through. In the footage from Frank's final pick, another subtle clue can be found: his physicality. Frank's movements had slowed, and his body language reflected a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. While he had always been tough, resilient, and seemingly invincible, the truth was that Frank had been silently battling severe back issues for years. The physical toll from decades of lifting antiques, bending over cramped spaces, and enduring the demands of a physically taxing job had left him in constant pain. But Frank, ever the professional, had pushed through it, unwilling to show weakness or admit defeat. Looking back, it's heartbreaking to realize just how much Frank had been enduring behind the scenes. His decision to keep pushing forward, despite the pain, is a testament to his strength of character. He was a man who, even in his final moments on American Pickers, never let on how much he was truly struggling. And for those who knew him best, the signs were there all along, hidden beneath the surface of the show. Though Frank may have left American Pickers without a formal farewell, his legacy continues to live on in the hearts of fans, who remember him for the genuine, kind-hearted man he was. As the months passed after Frank's disappearance from American Pickers, fans began to piece together the puzzling silence surrounding his absence. At first, many assumed it was simply a health issue that caused Frank to step away from the show. Mike Wolfe, ever the optimist, briefly mentioned that Frank had undergone back surgery, but details were scarce, and the subject was left somewhat mysterious. For some fans, this was enough to accept at face value. However, for others, the lack of further explanation only fueled growing suspicions about what had really happened behind the scenes. It wasn't just about his health problems anymore. Something deeper and darker seemed to be lurking. The true nature of Frank's departure from the show was something that fans didn't want to acknowledge. Yet it became more impossible to ignore as time went on. Beneath the surface of Frank's absence was a story of a long-running feud, one that had been quietly festering for years between Frank and Mike. Fans had grown accustomed to seeing Frank and Mike as the quintessential duo on American Pickers. They were more than just co-stars. They were best friends, bonded by a shared passion for collecting antiques and traveling the country. Together, they were inseparable on screen, their chemistry undeniable. But as much as they appeared to have the perfect partnership, a rift had slowly begun to form in their friendship long before Frank's departure. To understand the depth of this fallout, you have to look back at the years leading up to Frank's last appearance on the show. Frank and Mike had built American Pickers from the ground up, traveling thousands of miles in cramped vans and digging through people's forgotten treasures. However, somewhere along the way, the foundation of their friendship started to crack. Frank later revealed that by 2021, he and Mike hadn't spoken directly for nearly 2 years. The reason? Frank felt abandoned. As he struggled with his painful back injury and other health issues, Frank claimed that Mike had failed to check in on him, offering no support during a time when Frank needed it the most. This abandonment fueled a growing sense of resentment and mistrust in Frank, and he began to feel like an afterthought. The tension between them became even more complicated when Frank expressed his belief that Mike was trying to push him out of the picture in favor of his brother, Robbie Wolfe, who had begun making appearances on the show. Frank felt that Mike was setting the stage for Robbie to take his place, leaving him in the shadows. This perception, whether rooted in paranoia or reality, sent shockwaves through the fan base. For years, American Pickers had been defined by the bond between Frank and Mike, but now that bond seemed to be fraying at the edges, and fans couldn't help but notice the subtle signs of this shift. Small interactions between the two, which had once felt innocent and humorous, now seemed laden with tension. Jokes that had been light-hearted in the past now appeared barbed, and their exchanges had an undercurrent of passive aggression that wasn't there before. Fans who had grown to love their friendship couldn't ignore the feeling that something had changed, and they began to take sides in a way they never expected. By the time of Frank's final pick, Many viewers had already noticed these signs, but there was still a sense of disbelief. Frank had always been the more introverted of the two, but in that last episode, there were moments where he appeared distant from Mike, almost as if he were withdrawing. Rather than engaging in their usual banter, Frank spent long moments quietly observing, his eyes lingering on the items around him rather than on his friend. For fans who watched the episode after the fact, this moment of distance became particularly painful, as it hinted at the growing divide between them. Many fans mourned not only the loss of Frank's presence on the show, but also the end of what they had believed to be an unbreakable bond. As fans continued to rewatch Frank's last pick and reflected on the subtle clues they had missed at the time, a heartbreaking picture began to emerge. In hindsight, the awkward silences, the moments of discomfort, and the strained interactions between Frank and Mike painted a story of a friendship unraveling in real time. Frank, who had always been the affable and easygoing counterpart to Mike's more serious demeanor, seemed to be fighting a quiet battle. The weight of his physical pain, combined with the emotional strain of a broken friendship, created a perfect storm that was ultimately captured on camera for all to see. Despite Frank's best efforts to push through, fans couldn't help but feel that they were witnessing a man who was slowly withdrawing, not just physically, but emotionally. The sadness in his eyes, the brief moments of forced laughter, and the quiet solitude that seemed to follow him as he worked, all seemed to hint at a deeper sadness that went beyond his health struggles. It was a tragedy unfolding quietly, captured forever in the background of what seemed like just another day of picking. When Frank passed away 2 years later after suffering a devastating stroke, the outpouring of grief from fans was palpable. The loss was not just personal, it felt like the end of an era for American pickers. The void left by Frank's death was felt across the fan community, who had grown to love him as a genuine, down-to-earth person with a unique sense of humor. It was the loss of a beloved character, but also of a man who had given so much to his fans without ever asking for anything in return. Yet, it was Frank's last pick, that seemingly ordinary day at a crumbling marina in Kansas City, that left the deepest mark on viewers. It wasn't the dramatic moment of a grand farewell. Instead, it was a quiet, almost unnoticed ending that encapsulated the pain Frank had been carrying. But as devastating as Frank's passing was, it also brought Mike Wolfe back into the public eye in a way nobody could have predicted. Mike, who had remained in the spotlight after Frank's departure, now found himself reflecting on their fractured relationship in the wake of Frank's death. The tension between them, that had once been a source of drama and speculation, was now a painful part of their shared history. What had started as a friendship built on trust and a shared love of picking had become a complicated legacy, filled with unanswered questions and unresolved emotions. Fans who had once seen Mike and Frank as the perfect team were now left to grapple with the reality of their broken bond, unsure of how to reconcile the two sides of their relationship, the friendship they adored and the fractured reality that had led to its end. In the aftermath of Frank's death, the situation surrounding his estate took an even more dramatic turn, and the emotions ran deep as new revelations came to light. Frank Fritz had left behind a fortune, a net worth that most would never have expected from a man whose primary fame came from picking antiques and flipping them for profit. It was later revealed that Frank's fortune amounted to a staggering $6 million, amassed from his successful role on American Pickers, where he reportedly earned around $300,000 per season. Additionally, his antique shop, Frank Fritz Finds in Illinois, had been a continuous source of income, particularly from the sale of rare toys and vintage motorcycles. Even after his departure from TV, Frank's investments continued to bring in around $60,000 per year, securing his financial future. Yet, in the wake of his health struggles and stroke in 2022, much of that fortune was quickly siphoned off to pay for the round-the-clock care he required, $30,000 per month for in-home assistance and healthcare services. It was a staggering figure that consumed his wealth at an alarming rate, leaving him unable to enjoy the fruits of his labor during his final years. This loss of financial security seemed tragic in itself, but things would take a darker turn. Just weeks after Frank passed away on September 30th, 2024, his father, Bill Fritz, entered the picture in a dramatic and unexpected way. Bill contested Frank's will, claiming it was a forgery. This accusation came as a shock to Frank's friends and those who had been by his side throughout his final months. According to them, Frank had written the will in 2023, just 8 months after he had been placed under guardianship following his stroke. The court had even accepted this will, and it had been officially validated by a judge on October 18th, 2024. However, Bill Fritz was adamant that his son had not signed the will, stating that Frank was too incapacitated after the stroke to make such decisions. Bill's legal team argued that Frank's condition was so severe that he had been unable to care for himself, much less make legal decisions such as drafting a will. In Bill's lawsuit, he insisted that Frank's will should be discarded entirely, claiming it was a blatant forgery. He argued that he, as Frank's only remaining family, had the right to inherit everything, from Frank's $6 million fortune to his prized motorcycle collection and rare antiques. Bill painted himself as the loving father who had shared special moments with Frank, from deep-sea fishing trips to family vacations at his home in St. Thomas. But those who had been closest to Frank were quick to dispute Bill's narrative. Frank's friends and caregivers who had been there for him during his final years pointed out that Bill had barely been involved in Frank's life for decades, let alone during his struggles with health. They claimed that Bill had visited Frank only once after his stroke and had refused to step in for guardianship responsibilities when Frank needed support the most. To them, Bill's sudden appearance after Frank's death and his insistence on taking control of the estate raised serious questions about his true motivations. The legal battle over Frank's estate became even more contentious as Bill's legal team pushed forward with their argument that Frank had been incapacitated and unable to manage his affairs. Court records indeed showed that Frank had been under a court-ordered guardianship following his stroke, which lent weight to Bill's claims that Frank couldn't have made decisions like writing a will. This ruling seemed to support Bill's contention that the 2023 will was invalid, and it made the case for Frank's friends more complicated. But Frank's friends were not willing to back down. They fought back fiercely, presenting evidence that seemed to contradict Bill's narrative. The key piece of evidence presented by Frank's friends was a series of personal statements and documentation that painted a very different picture of Frank's final months. They argued that despite his physical limitations, Frank had remained mentally sharp and capable of making decisions about his future. In fact, they claimed that Frank had been actively involved in the process of writing his will, even while under guardianship. Additionally, they pointed to the fact that Frank had written letters to those closest to him, expressing his wishes for how he wanted his estate handled after his death. These letters, they argued, were clear indications that Frank had been coherent and intentional about his decisions, even if he was physically unable to care for himself. Moreover, there were reports from Frank's caregivers and medical professionals who had worked with him during his recovery, all of whom testified that Frank had been mentally aware of his circumstances, particularly in the months leading up to his death. They asserted that Frank had been lucid enough to understand the consequences of his decisions, and that he had expressed clear wishes about his assets and the people he wanted to care for them. This testimony was crucial in undermining Bill's claims and reinforcing the legitimacy of the 2023 will. As the case went forward, the tension surrounding Frank's estate grew, with fans and the public alike divided over who had the rightful claim to his fortune. The emotional stakes of the battle were high, as it became increasingly clear that Frank's final wishes were now a source of major conflict. Was Bill Fritz truly trying to claim what he believed was rightfully his, or was he attempting to take advantage of a situation to gain control of his son's fortune? And was Frank's will truly the last reflection of his desires, or was it the result of manipulation? This loss of financial security seemed tragic in itself, but things would take a darker turn. Just weeks after Frank passed away on September 30th, 2024, his father, Bill Fritz, entered the picture in a dramatic and unexpected way. Bill contested Frank's will, claiming it was a forgery. This accusation came as a shock to Frank's friends and those who had been by his side throughout his final months. According to them, Frank had written the will in 2023, just 8 months after he had been placed under guardianship following his stroke. The court had even accepted this will, and it had been officially validated by a judge on October 18, 2024. However, Bill Fritz was adamant that his son had not signed the will, stating that Frank was too incapacitated after the stroke to make such decisions. Bill's legal team argued that Frank's condition was so severe that he had been unable to care for himself, much less make legal decisions such as drafting a will. In Bill's lawsuit, he insisted that Frank's will should be discarded entirely, claiming it was a blatant forgery. He argued that he, as Frank's only remaining family, had the right to inherit everything, from Frank's $6 million fortune to his prized motorcycle collection and rare antiques. Bill painted himself as the loving father who had shared special moments with Frank, from deep-sea fishing trips to family vacations at his home in St. Thomas. But those who had been closest to Frank were quick to dispute Bill's narrative. Frank's friends and caregivers who had been there for him during his final years pointed out that Bill had barely been involved in Frank's life for decades, let alone during his struggles with health. They claimed that Bill had visited Frank only once after his stroke and had refused to step in for guardianship responsibilities when Frank needed support the most. To them, Bill's sudden appearance after Frank's death and his insistence on taking control of the estate raised serious questions about his true motivations. The legal battle over Frank's estate became even more contentious as Bill's legal team pushed forward with their argument that Frank had been incapacitated and unable to manage his affairs. Court records indeed showed that Frank had been under a court-ordered guardianship following his stroke, which lent weight to Bill's claims that Frank couldn't have made decisions like writing a will. This ruling seemed to support Bill's contention that the 2023 will was invalid, and it made the case for Frank's friends more complicated. But Frank's friends were not willing to back down. They fought back fiercely, presenting evidence that seemed to contradict Bill's narrative. The key piece of evidence presented by Frank's friends was a series of personal statements and documentation that painted a very different picture of Frank's final months. They argued that despite his physical limitations, Frank had remained mentally sharp and capable of making decisions about his future. In fact, they claimed that Frank had been actively involved in the process of writing his will, even while under guardianship. Additionally, they pointed to the fact that Frank had written letters to those closest to him, expressing his wishes for how he wanted his estate handled after his death. These letters, they argued, were clear indications that Frank had been coherent and intentional about his decisions, even if he was physically unable to care for himself. Moreover, there were reports from Frank's caregivers and medical professionals who had worked with him during his recovery, all of whom testified that Frank had been mentally aware of his circumstances, particularly in the months leading up to his death. They asserted that Frank had been lucid enough to understand the consequences of his decisions and that he had expressed clear wishes about his assets and the people he wanted to care for them. This testimony was crucial in undermining Bill's claims and reinforcing the legitimacy of the 2023 will. As the case went forward, the tension surrounding Frank's estate grew, with fans and the public alike divided over who had the rightful claim to his fortune. The emotional stakes of the battle were high, as it became increasingly clear that Frank's final wishes were now a source of major conflict. Was Bill Fritz truly trying to claim what he believed was rightfully his, or was he attempting to take advantage of a situation to gain control of his son's fortune? And was Frank's will truly the last reflection of his desires, or was it the result of manipulation? Ultimately, this legal dispute became yet another chapter in a story that had been defined by loss, tension, and reconciliation. Fans who had followed Frank's journey for years felt the weight of his final moments and the complicated aftermath that followed. The situation surrounding his estate, with its messy legal battles and lingering questions, added yet another layer of heartache to a story that had already been filled with sorrow. As the case continued to unfold, it was clear that Frank's legacy his friendships, and the emotions surrounding his death would continue to be contested in ways that no one had ever expected. As the legal battle over Frank Fritz's estate continued, the stakes grew higher, and the public's perception of his passing became increasingly clouded by accusations, legal drama, and deep family conflict. Frank's close friends, who had stepped in as his support system during his final years, remained steadfast in their belief that Frank was fully capable of making his own decisions, including the creation of his will. They were unwavering in their defense of Frank's wishes, claiming that he had written and signed the will during Memorial Day weekend in 2023, while he was still mentally sharp and aware of his circumstances. Frank's longtime friend and American Pickers co-star, Mike Wolfe, lent his support to this claim, stating that Frank had been completely alert and coherent during their emotional reunion that year. Mike, who had previously been estranged from Frank, confirmed that their time together in 2023 showed no signs of cognitive decline or incapacity on Frank's part. This statement from Mike, who had witnessed firsthand Frank's mental clarity, added a layer of credibility to Frank's friend's arguments that the will was legitimate and a true reflection of his desires. However, the legal battle took a dramatic turn when Bill Fritz's lawyer, Corey Gurley, made explosive accusations, suggesting that the will could not be legally valid. Gurley argued that the will had not been properly signed or witnessed according to Iowa law, promising to present evidence that would show the document was not legally binding. This set the stage for a bitter courtroom showdown that threatened to expose deeply personal and painful details about Frank's life, medical history, and relationships. Frank's friends, who had been by his side during his final years, were incensed by the accusation and fought back hard. They pointed to the fact that the courts had already accepted the will and that its authenticity had been confirmed by a judge. To them, this was clear proof that Frank had not only been capable of making decisions, but had done so in a coherent and deliberate manner. The deeper the case went, the more it became clear that the conflict was not simply about a will or money. It was about who had the right to claim Frank's legacy. Frank's friends argued that Bill Fritz had been a largely absent figure in Frank's life, especially in his adult years. According to court documents, Frank had little to no contact with his biological family, particularly after he became an adult. Instead, Frank had built his own chosen family of friends who had stood by him through thick and thin, offering love and support when his biological family had not. This made Bill's sudden reappearance after Frank's death all the more suspicious. Frank's friends were adamant that Bill had not been a supportive father during Frank's illness, and had only emerged after Frank's passing in an attempt to seize control of his estate. Bill's legal team, on the other hand, painted a different picture, accusing Frank's friends of manipulating Frank's isolation during his stroke and using it as an opportunity to turn him against his biological family. They argued that Frank's friends had purposefully kept Bill away, preventing him from having a relationship with his son and influencing Frank's decisions. This accusation further fueled the emotional divide, turning the case into a bitter public feud about family, loyalty, love, and trust. As the case progressed, it became clear that this was not just a legal battle over a will. It was a fight over who truly knew and loved Frank Fritz. The request for a jury trial by Bill Fritz was another blow to Frank's friends, as it meant that the deeply personal aspects of Frank's life would be aired publicly. Medical records, private conversations, and details about Frank's health and mental state would be examined in front of a jury, potentially undermining the privacy and dignity of both Frank and his friends. Those who had been closest to Frank during his final years were devastated by the turn of events. They had hoped to celebrate Frank's life and legacy quietly and respectfully, but instead they found themselves forced to defend their actions and their relationship with Frank in a public courtroom drama. Fans of American Pickers watched in shock as this personal tragedy unfolded in the headlines, with many divided over who had the right to Frank's estate. Some supported Bill, believing that as Frank's biological father, he had a claim to his son's legacy. Others sided with Frank's friends, convinced that they had done everything they could to honor Frank's wishes and provide him with the care and support he needed in his final years. For many, The legal battle was not just about money, it was about the idea of who truly understood and loved Frank Fritz. The conflict exposed the raw emotions and fractured relationships that had existed for years beneath the surface, and fans were left to wonder whether the truth would ever fully come to light. As the legal drama unfolded, it became clear that Frank's passing, which had been a deeply emotional moment for many, was now being overshadowed by a public spectacle of suspicion and greed. The media frenzy surrounding his estate created a sense of unease among fans who had once admired Frank for his simple, down-to-earth nature. They had come to know him as a man who loved the thrill of the hunt for antiques, a man whose charm and wit had captivated audiences for years. Now, however, his legacy was being picked apart by those closest to him, and fans were left questioning whether Frank's quiet life and simple joys could ever be remembered without the cloud of controversy that now hung over his name. In the midst of this legal turmoil, one question persisted. Would Frank himself have wanted this? Would he have wanted his life and legacy to be the subject of such a bitter battle over his estate? Or would he have simply preferred to be remembered for the person he was? The collector, the picker, the charming TV personality who brought joy to millions. It was a painful irony that Frank, who had lived much of his life in relative privacy, had become the center of a public spectacle that threatened to overshadow everything he had worked for and loved. The twists and turns of the case only deepened the sense of uncertainty surrounding his final wishes, and the battle over his estate showed no signs of letting up anytime soon. For fans and friends alike, Frank's story had taken a tragic and unexpected turn, leaving everyone to wonder how things had gotten so complicated after such a simple, genuine life.